In order to understand the instability in Iraq, you must first understand the different players, their motives, and the location of the country. So let's meet the players. You have the Sunnis from the west and the Shia from the southeast. These two groups have not got along for over 1400 years because of fundamental religious differences. Then you have the Kurds from the north who don't get along with either the Sunni or the Shia, and the US from halfway around the world trying to figure it all out. For most, it is difficult to understand why Iraq is such an important place. Why would so many people be so concerned over a patch of desert? Well, Iraq is much more than just a desert. It is rich in natural resources, and more importantly, it has a very powerful central location in the Middle East. After World War I, when the British conquered the Ottoman Empire, they divided up the land with the French and drew the borders for the country of Iraq. In doing so, Iraq became the de facto boxing ring for the Middle East. The Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds all want control of the nation, and the nations around Iraq have a vested interest in seeing that a specific sect has control over this central country. For example, you have the Sunni-dominated Saudi Arabia rooting for the Sunnis, Shia-dominated Iran for the Shias, and Kurd-dominated Turkey for the Kurds. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq based on incorrect information that the country, and more specifically Saddam, possessed weapons of mass destruction. They removed Saddam and his entire party from rule, essentially toppling the Iraqi government. After a couple different types of insurgent efforts, and the position of the control over the country left essentially vacant, sectarian violence exploded across the country, with each entity battling to take control. Realizing that the removal of Saddam could be the cause of a nationwide civil war or a greater regional war, the US were forced to stay. Their goal now was to prevent war and rebuild the government to bring stability to the nation and the region. At the beginning of this effort, the US set up camp in large bases called forward operating bases. To minimize American casualties, they often only left the bases to go on scheduled patrols, break up skirmishes, or to clear a neighborhood or village, and then return immediately back to the base. This strategy had some inherent weaknesses. Existing in the bases and traveling in armored vehicles isolated the military from the civilians that truly needed their help and protection. Not everyone in Iraq is a violent insurgent battling for power. In fact, most of the population are peaceful civilians who want the violence to stop and the government to be rebuilt so they can go back to their lives of being a shop owner, doctor, lawyer, or another functioning member of society. Unfortunately, there are just a few extremists that take advantage of the US's lack of connection to the Iraqi people. They knew that if they could attack and then blend back into society, the US couldn't tell the difference between insurgent and civilian and would end up killing civilians in order to make sure they got the insurgent. Each new civilian death creates a new source for insurgent recruits as friends, family, and tribe members seek revenge and join the attacks on the US. More civilians turn to insurgents, leading to more attacks on the US, which creates an ever-increasing cycle of violence. In 2006, under General Petraeus, the US understands that their conventional warfare tactics are not helping, but are actually contributing to the problem. They switched to a strategy of counterinsurgency whose main tenet is to win the trust of the people by protecting the civilians from the insurgents. To do this, the US military had to get the Iraqi civilians to not see them as an outside force invading their land and killing innocent people, but as a peacekeeping force that was there to help rebuild. It meant that they had to get out from behind their huge bases and armored vehicles and communicate with the people that they were there to help. Face-to-face interaction and speaking with civilians on a daily basis had some interesting side effects. One, the Iraqis could better identify with the American military men and women as real people and not just a mechanized force of tanks and Hummers. Two, connecting with the Iraqi people on a personal level made it easier for the US to distinguish between insurgent and civilian. Three, the Iraqi civilians were far more willing to share information about the organization and whereabouts of the insurgents with the US. Four, the Americans were able to get the Iraqis to trust them and to understand they were both working towards the same goal: get the country stable so the US can leave. Fully embracing counterinsurgency, the US moved from a few forward operating bases to a lot of small bases set up in neighborhoods and in old police stations throughout the country. It was a very effective strategy that required more troops to further isolate the insurgents from the civilians, and it gave the Iraqis the much-needed peaceful environment to rebuild local businesses and communities. By doing their part to stop the violence, the Americans thought this would translate into an environment where the central government in Iraq could rebuild itself. Unfortunately, this has not happened. The Iraqi government has to be rebuilt from the ground up. And by fully embracing counterinsurgency, some believe that all the US have done is to create a dependency on their presence for peace, and that as soon as they leave, the insurgents will be back to their old tricks. The central question in the current debate is, will the insurgents be able to bait the country back into civil war, or is the Iraqi country stable enough to rebuild its government after the US leave? Thank you for watching, and I look forward to your responses.